got about an hour to place all the conversations today in a bit of an international context, with some help all the way from San Francisco there, as well as our panelists here. Good morning, Kati. We will, following up from the industrial strategy panel, this is very relevant as we are kind of looking, because they've been very much mixed together in the whole conversation around geopolitics of technology and the trade policy elements of it. So we'll try in about 50 minutes or so to cover the world and UK's role in it. We have a year ahead. I mean, some of them have already happened, but we have a full year of elections that are very much going to change how the world and the world of trade and geopolitics looks like over the next 12 months or so, so by January 2025. And I'm delighted to kind of try to unpack some of this in 50 minutes with an excellent panel. We've got David Lidington, a familiar face, I'm sure, to a lot of you, Chair of the Royal United Services Institute, Sam Sharps from the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, Kati Suominen joining us from San Francisco, who's a known resident expert with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and George Riddell, Director of Trade Policy and Strategy at EY. So David, can I start with you? Crystal ball gazing. We are in January 2025. All these elections have happened. Yep. How does the world look like, and what does the UK tech sector need to do now to prepare?
Oh, the underlying challenges, whatever the outcome of the elections, the underlying challenges are going to be very much the same, and that's not to underestimate the significance of the US choice in November. I actually think that whether it's Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer, who is sitting in number 10 this time next year, that the challenges that we're focusing on in this gathering won't have changed much. The choices available won't have changed. I mean, the reality, if you look at the world today, is that people have been writing about a multipolar world for the last decade and a half. We're now living in it. And that was something that became very clear in the global reaction to the Russian assault on Ukraine in February 2022. I loathe the phrase global south, but use that as convenient shorthand. How countries in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America reacted to that depended upon how they saw their interest, or indeed whether they saw their interest as being involved and at stake at all, which many of them did not. And what we see in the world now is not just a growing American focus upon the Indo-Pacific and on a strategic rivalry with China in particular, and a corresponding lessening of American concern for European security and automatic identification of US with European interests. But elsewhere in the world, large numbers of countries that are making a very hard-headed decision about how they see their own interest and are not wanting to be taken for granted as aligned with any particular great power or other. So if you look at the Saudis, there's a long-term strategic defence and security alliance with the United States, but that hasn't stopped them talking to Moscow, and it didn't stop them approaching Beijing when MBS wanted to get off the hook in Yemen. And one of his advisors said to me, there's no point in talking to the Americans, they have zero influence in Tehran, the Chinese do have influence, they're Iran's biggest trading partner, so we go and talk to the Chinese about a truce with the Iranians. You see it in South Africa or Nigeria or Ethiopia or Brazil or Mexico or Chile or Indonesia. No, we don't want to join the BRICS, thank you very much. We see our future as G20 or even G7 one day. Countries are making their own minds up. And so we are in a world which is going to be turbulent, where we're going to need to think not just about predictable grand alliances, but about the multiple interests of many different countries when it comes to economic and technological regulatory spheres, as well as to security policy. Now, the good news for the UK and for the tech sector is that the growing importance of technology for security, but also for the delivery of public services and the transformation of the private sector means that the market for the products and services that tech provides is going to grow dramatically. And I saw something in the FT recently that predicted a tenfold expansion in the cybersecurity market over the next decades. To take one example, you heard the Chancellor in the budget statement the other day saying that he sees technology as the key to transforming the flexibility, the public-centeredness and the efficiency and value for money of public services. And whether it's Jeremy Hunt or Rachel Reeves, whether it's Vicky Atkins or whether it's Wes Streeting, that is going to be the choice that whoever is in government pursues. So the market opportunities are enormous and the markets are global. The downside is that precisely because technology is of such vital significance in the delivery of both private and public goods and services, and because it is increasingly an integral element of what we term critical national infrastructure, that's not just about dams and power plants, but it's about the systems on which our society relies for stable civilized life. The control of technology is going to become something of increasing concern to governments worldwide, and they're going to want to make sure that adversaries don't get control of it. And that will have a number of consequences. So just very, very quickly, just flag for you. First, it means that the tendency for onshoring, but also for surveillance of mergers and acquisitions, is going to continue. And that has already changed in the past 5 years. I can remember some of the early National Security Council debates about Huawei and the early discussions in the May government about the extent to which we are open to technological trade with China. And I would say if you look at where the British government is today, they're in a more protectionist, more hardline place than they were in Theresa May's time. If you look at the United States, Joe Biden has clearly bet a lot on the idea that the US is going to be the place where technological investments are centred, and where it's the US way of doing things that therefore informs how technology is developed and its applications expanded. That in turn means that there's going to be an argument about the standards and the global regulations that apply. Can we realistically any longer even aspire to the idea of a single global digital space? I think frankly the chances of that are looking pretty slim. Whatever the hopes, when I was started in government in 2010, and much more likely now, I fear, is that we will see the emergence of a US-dominated sphere, a Chinese-dominated sphere, question mark whether the EU will align with the Americans or whether the EU will try to establish its own pole of attraction for regulation of technology. I mean, you can see already in some of the legislation that the EU is hoping to reproduce more broadly what they've done with the data protection legislation. And I think a lot may depend upon the outcome of the elections in November here, that if, put it bluntly, if Trump is elected, I think the US is likely to become even more protectionist and nationalistic and disinclined to do a deal in the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council than if Biden is re-elected. And similarly, if you get a move towards more nationalist inclined governments in European Union member states, and the big member states, that in turn will strengthen the arm of those who, like Macron, to argue for European strategic sovereignty. So there's going to be a battle over whose standards should prevail, and it may be that India ends up as being the swing power here in global terms. And yes, it's a democratic state. Strategically, it's being forced by its rivalry with China to align more with Australia, the United States and Japan. But Modi is still very interested in security, and therefore there's quite a lot that's attractive to Indian securocrats about how China is developing and using artificial intelligence, visual recognition, other applications of new technology to exercise control over potential dissent. Finally, there is the issue about exports, and this is very much a live issue with Ukraine, and we will see this, I think, as a more general challenge. We used to have, in the Cold War, a system called COCOM, which regulated the trade that was allowed to the Soviet bloc from the West. And I think we're moving into an era where that kind of approach is going to be developed again to regulate the widgets and the type of technology, the know-how that can be supplied to powers who are thought to be actually or potentially hostile to our interest. And the question of how we deal with China is the big challenge there. But as African countries develop, as Asian countries make their own choices, there will be decisions that our government and different Western governments will have to make about the extent to which we want to interpose on security grounds new regulations on trade in the way of an economically advantageous trading deal. And with the UK in all this, my last point will be this: I think there's really tricky choices for the UK because we've chosen to be out of the big European trading bloc and regulatory bloc. We don't have a say in setting their policies any longer, and we're not a part of the United States either. We're not in the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council at the moment. We're in the difficult position of really keeping our ear pressed to the door, trying to find out what they're talking about inside, which is not comfortable. And I think that, therefore, strategic decisions for whoever's in government here to work out to what extent do we decide that, even outside the EU, our interests are in practical terms going to be mostly aligned with our fellow European democracies, therefore we need to establish some new sort of partnership, semi-detached with them, or do we throw in our lot with the United States? I think that the opportunities for a bold sort of privateer to navigate successfully what are going to be increasingly choppy seas between the great trading blocs are going to be more limited in the decades to come, so that will place some difficult choices, whether it's a Labour or a Conservative government here.
Wow, thank you. That's setting the scene for sure. I was wondering, because you mentioned this, clear Chinese, US, or Western Eastern Bloc, or however you want to put them, as kind of leading in terms of what may the new kind of, if you were to fragment the internet, if you want, into the rules and regulations around it. I'm wondering, where does that leave, and I hate the word as much as you do, what does that leave? I'll put it as the global majority, right? Because there is a whole lot of countries that will then try to play both blocks, or be part of both blocks. And I'm feeling, in a way, it's a lot less about our work in trying to make friends and a lot more about their kind of strategic interest there in where they go. So how does this, if it's led by an Eastern Western bloc, with Europe trying to figure it out, but let's say probably more in the Western bloc by the nature of its democracies and values, where does that lead everyone else?
There'll be a certain number of countries who have a commitment to what we term Western values, to democratic institutions, the rule of law, and human rights. So those countries will be all around the world, and they will feel an attraction to an American or an Americo-European approach. There'll be others where, frankly, it'll depend upon the man or woman in charge. That if they're the sort that want to have greater control over their populations, then the Chinese model becomes much more attractive to them. And there'll be others who will basically look at the bottom line. We saw with vaccines in COVID how the Chinese sought to use the supply of vaccines as a tool of diplomatic soft power. And I think they will do exactly the same with technology as they already do with development aid. You look around the world, look at what's been happening in the South Pacific with Tuvalu. Well, Tuvalu, the PM was forced out because he wouldn't do the deal with the Chinese. Solomon Islands and Nauru did a deal with China, and that was well lubricated with Chinese money. You look at what happened in the Maldives, I think just last week, where Chinese have agreed a security pact which has involved the expulsion of Indian advisors to the previous Maldivian government. That is the sort of way in which rivalry will play out. And I could see that as part of a Belt and Road package, the Chinese government, thinking about Chinese interests, would offer to supply the technology that goes with, let us say, a power investment in a particular country, and that then starts to become the way in which that country does things, because you've accepted this, it's free or cut price, so why not stick with the Chinese? Why should you go after a more expensive American product?
Agree, and there is a very good map that I'm sure some of you have seen on kind of network infrastructure and the countries that have accepted Huawei and Chinese products and the countries that have banned them on national security grounds. It's a whole map of the world that's that is very happy to accept Chinese products. So they're cheaper, more economically convenient, even if there are security concerns. Kati, I will turn to you now, zooming in a bit on US. You know, we've got probably the election this year coming up there. Wondering if you can run us a bit through, you know, what for the turbulent times of US trade policy. It's gone through its ups and downs in the last few years. And, you know, I'll do the same with the crystal ball gazing with you. Where do we go? How does January 2025 look like for US trade policy?
Thanks very much. Thank you for having me. Can you hear me okay? Yes, okay, perfect. Thank you. Wonderful opening from the colleagues on the panel. Thanks so much for having me as well. Well, I think, you know, if we look at the US trade policy, I think it's been, from my perspective, just going more down than up in the past number of months and years, 7 years literally. We've really gone from the pursuit of market access to more managed trade in the United States. And I think this will probably continue as was alluded to before on the panel. I would say, you know, if we, for those that haven't necessarily followed play what has been going on in the United States, the Biden administration has very much continued the policies of the Trump administration to a surprising degree in terms of continuing the tariffs on steel and aluminum, continuing the tariffs on China that the Trump administration rose from 3% to 21%. There has been, you know, these tariffs have been retained despite the inflationary pressures they've created, despite the consumer prices that have increased as a result. Manufacturing output has also been down as a result of the tariffs and the retaliation that has followed. And there has also been reduction of employment. Empirical studies now show, for instance, of farmers and other industries that were hurt by the retaliation. But nonetheless, we are now in this setting where protectionism has continued. There's been also kind of an abandonment of America's leadership, as you all know, on digital trade issues. In October, the US withdrew its proposals from the WTO's e-commerce discussions on critical issues for US companies, on data flows, on protection of source code, on preventing data localization practices. And this, of course, drew really powerful criticism here from industry as well as from Congress, from both sides of the aisle, in fact. But nonetheless, this line has continued and was reflected very much in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, the IPEF process in Asia-Pacific, where the United States has been a leader and has successfully concluded 3 pillars of the IPEF discussions, but the trade pillar, which is the 4th pillar and something that certainly was hoped for by the US industry to continue, has stalled because of these digital trade decisions. So there really has been a challenge on this front for US technology companies, and US tech is also not getting much support on kind of discussions, for instance, on the DMA that, as you know, the European Union has just rolled out. So that's another set of trade policy decisions. And then the third is really the merging, if you want, of national security and trade policy in the United States. So there's been a number of export controls that are about preventing, for instance, China to access semiconductor industries or critical supplies of this kind, both in terms of investment into China and trade with China. And there's been also this new export control on U.S. citizens' data to countries like China or North Korea, Iran, and so forth. So in the main, these are just examples of export controls and kind of managed trade approaches that have been taken. So where would we go in the next administration? Would this change? Well, I think the Biden administration has been indicating that it would continue the same policies going forward. So we would expect to see a lot of continuity on these issues. The Trump administration certainly would be, at least has been talking about to be much more protectionist, perhaps impose a 10% flat tariff on everybody, and then a 60% tariff on China. This may be just, of course, posturing or seeking to gain some leverage, but that has been in the discussions, and of course, this would be more, even going from managed trade to import substitution, I would say, in the Trump era. So I guess where does this leave the UK? Difficult position as you're there with the Europeans as well, and do you have to then choose? I don't know, but I think it would be useful, and I'm sure your officials are doing a great deal already on this, is to keep preempting the protectionist growth, if you want, particularly when it comes to the UK. Perhaps there's an opportunity to pursue a US-UK trade agreement after the election, and have kind of more forward-looking digital and tech rules. Maybe there's an opportunity to establish standards, as was discussed before, kind of common standards, and set a global, some sort of a global framework as a result, for instance, on AI and AI standards. And then there is certainly opportunities to establish common ground on security issues, right? On supply chain security, on cyber security issues, protecting sea lanes, what have you. I think this would resonate for both the Republicans and Democrats. And then, of course, with the Democrats, the climate change. We can discuss the trade agenda in terms of climate change, something that the UK also cares about. Could be potentially also good common ground. And now, after the WTO meeting, the WTO reform is something that I think both the US and the UK could pursue together, and there will probably be enough support for that here as well. So I think there's a common agenda here to work on, regardless of who is in the administration. And the UK is still a great partner and ally to the United States, and I think it holds on both sides of the aisle. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Kati. And I will kind of turn a bit around the panel here, because you did mention WTO reform, so I'm definitely going to George on this one. Just finished the ministerial, didn't look that bright. We got there with a little bit of something for the tech sector and the broader services economy with the extension of the moratorium for another 2 years. For those of you who don't know, that's basically the baseline agreement of the WTO that no country will impose tariffs on electronic transmissions is the reason why we have the digital economy looking as it does. It barely survived at the last ministerial, probably for another 2 years. So in that context of WTO reform, 2 years from now, we're at the WTO again. Do we still have a WTO? And is there anything for the tech sector, for the broader services economy in there that still matters?
Thanks, Sabina. So I think the headline message from the 13th Ministerial Conference at the WTO, which took place a couple of weeks ago, is that the WTO didn't collapse. It did the absolute bare minimum in that it didn't go backwards and impose new barriers to trade. As Sabina said, we secured another 2 years for the moratorium on imposing customs duties on electronic transmissions. And also India and South Africa dropped their long-standing objections to the entry into force of domestic regulation for services, which was something that was agreed over 2 years ago now, so that can now enter into force and proceed. So small incremental steps forward, but I would say that, you know, the outlook isn't particularly rosy when it comes to multilateral cooperation. You know, we have very deep-seated divisions that is reflective of that wider geopolitical world that David was talking about. Going forward, I think we definitely see the future of the WTO as a collection of plurilateral initiatives, so subsections of countries coming together and saying we want to advance rules on, you know, specific issues. We've seen that in investment facilitation, in the margins of the WTO ministerial. We've seen small progress in the e-commerce joint initiative. Yes, it did take a knock, as Kati said, the US withdrew its support for the more ambitious provisions within that concerning data flows, data localization, but there's still a lot in that agreement as it's currently drafted around facilitating electronic commerce and setting a baseline of rules, updating that WTO rulebook that was agreed before the internet really even existed in 1994. So even those small incremental steps forward among a plurilateral group of willing countries, I would see as a, you know, very positive step forward for the organization. I think we can't take for granted US leadership anymore. Those days are gone. Previously, what the US used to do was essentially trade compromise against access to its market. That was how you got these big multilateral deals done, was the US saying, no, I actually want to do this. You get, in exchange for access to my market, to sign up to all these new multilateral rules. I think we would all love a world where that resumed, but I don't see it happening. And then the WTO membership will face a very severe crisis if Trump is elected and follows through on his promise to withdraw the US from the WTO. And that will come as a very big crisis moment, I think, for the organization. Does it continue, or do you try and create something new as a result? So big question marks around what happens at the multilateral level and international trade.
Well, excellent. That's perfect then for Sam to kind of position the UK in this whole easy global context where everything works.
Well, why not? So I think my fellow panelists have put it all extremely nicely, and I want to start with David's point that we face a year of all these elections, the billions of people potentially voting. It could turn out to be actually slightly less eventful than we're kind of all thinking, right? So it is possible that Biden is re-elected, that Modi is re-elected. I'd say Putin's looking pretty strong to win. Xi isn't going anywhere. Von der Leyen will probably be in charge of the commission. And you'll have a set of democratic events that actually haven't turned the world upside down in leadership terms. Does that make any of the issues that governments are going to have to deal with, the UK government's going to have to deal with, leaving aside whether or not there's a change of government here, does that make those questions go away? No, absolutely not. And there's almost a risk, as I see it, that we spend, I guess, the rest of this year watching and waiting to see what happens in order to produce a strategy that is wasted time, because fundamentally there are lots of things we could be doing now, we could be thinking about now, or that we're just going to have to face up to at some point. And sort of just to run through those briefly, these are all themes that we've picked up on already. But following on from the last panel, I don't want to rehash any of that. Fundamentally, attempts to construct a trade policy in support of the UK has to go hand in hand with a set of competitive industries that are able to compete on the world stage and sell their services abroad. And so there are a set of questions the UK government's going to need to ask itself about what the right structure for that is. What are the industries that we feel we should be fostering and supporting? How do we do that in the best, most cost-efficient, most sensible way? And this is an awful lot of the work that TBI has done, and just to hammer the point home here, it's including the work that we've done between Tony and William Hague, to just kind of make the point that these aren't really party political questions, believing that there are huge opportunities in biotech and in AI for the country shouldn't really be a party line question, and that there's always the question of exactly where you place the emphasis and how you support it, but we've done a lot of work trying to nudge all that work forward. So if you take that as the first step, the second really, and again this is another thing that's come up, is the relationship with our nearest neighbours and allies is incredibly important, just as a fact of economic geography. The UK's relationship with the EU is going to be fundamental to the UK's success over a long period. And imagining there is a change of government, I think both major parties have made it fairly clear rejoining and reintegration into the single market is off the table for the moment. Okay, fine. There are still a set of questions about exactly what relationship the UK then has with the EU. And Peter Foster wrote a very interesting, although rather bleak book, basically saying, here are the many, many administrative and sort of technical steps we could take to align ourselves closer to the EU. What difference would it make? Well, a little bit, just a little bit. It'll have some marginal benefit. And working through all of that is going to be quite fundamental, I think, to where the UK positions itself. Not least because if there is, well, whether or not there is a change in the US, I think some of the pre-Brexit assumptions that a closer relationship with the US was A, available, and B, entirely desirable, have proven to be very difficult for people. And in the possibility that there's an across-the-board tariff on imports, what is the best possible outlook for the UK? Well, potentially, there could be some side deals done. There could be some measure of alignment or somehow quid pro quo on things that exempts certain UK sectors from these tariffs. I don't know, and that would give us a competitive advantage, I suppose, over others. But that's going to be quite a difficult and fraught process. And so the kind of automatic assumption that we could go and be friends and allies with the US in the absence of a close relationship with the EU just doesn't feel very straightforward, but it's worth thinking about, and I'm sure there are lots of foreign policy officials currently trying to construct that strategy. And the final thing, thinking more widely about institutions and overseas relationships, if you'll forgive me a quick anecdote. A long time ago, I was an official in the old Department of Trade and Industry, and I was working on WTO policy. And it was a time when multilateral trade had sort of weird status among the NGO community, and there were people rioting in the streets about trade liberalisation, and there was a huge kind of political focus on what we were doing. And we used to get piles of letters and postcards campaigning against the evils of everything that WTO was doing. And the headline on nearly all of them used to be, "Slow down the WTO." And I used to look at it and think, how would it be possible to make any less progress than we're currently achieving? But in 20 years, it turns out, yes, it is possible. We could slow it down to an absolute crawl, or to have it almost on life support. And, as a non-expert, but remembering those days, I think my instincts are exactly as we were saying just now, which is that the almost utopian feel of a multilateral organization that could work on consensus, and where small countries and large countries could effectively have equal weight. I mean, that's gone for the birds. I think there are other structures and there are other forums in which we can help to kind of facilitate some of these questions. But some of the more interesting ones are around standard setting and technical cooperation on emerging technologies. And I think it was David who said that the TTC, it would be lovely if we were part of that. And it's possible to imagine a kind of bigger coalition, possibly even Reggie talking about this, Sabina, where Japan and Korea and name a couple of other countries we're in. Doesn't seem available at the moment. And so we're left in this sort of interesting limbo where we're trying to make the running on some issues around AI safety, and that's been successful and recognised, I think. There will be other opportunities to do that, but we're going to have a certain amount of self-awareness that the UK can't just call the meeting and set the rules. There's geopolitical reality to deal with, and we're going to have to work through all that quite carefully. So in summary, I don't really know. I don't really have a kind of perfect answer where that leaves us, but there are a set of really difficult questions ahead, which could be, even in continuity, challenging. It could be, if there are, various developments in the world and in geopolitics, really, really pressing for us.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, the good old days when trade was exciting. I think Sam Lowe wrote a post after the last WTO where he basically said, trade is really boring right now because you don't have the protests anymore. That's how you know when we are up or down with trade policy. I want to pick up on and I want to come back to you, David, on the regulatory cooperation point. So one of the big things we hear time and again from our SMEs and from our members kind of across the sector is that the biggest trade barrier they face has got nothing to do with, pretty much trade agreements in a way. It's kind of the rules and regulations behind the border. In the tech sector, there have been a million of those. I'm still to meet a single government in the world who doesn't think is doing a much better job than anyone else when it regulates technology. So what is then the opportunity for, we've heard TTC, that's been an environment where they've tried to at least build the relationships to be able to advance some of the conversations. There's the G7, there's a TTC plus possibly. What are the opportunities that you can see for kind of regulatory cooperation, at least among like-minded countries, so we don't turn tech regulation into a trade barrier, basically?
It's in all of those precisely because there's not yet been any kind of settled agreement as to which institution should have the lead on any of this. And so I think if I were asked by number 10, what would your advice be? I would say it's about relationship building with like-minded powers. Yes, Washington, and yes, Brussels, not just Paris, Berlin and others. You have to deal with the reality of the EU institutionally, not think you could do it bilaterally or with member states. Yes, Japan, yes, Australia, yes, the ASEAN countries and South Korea, and if you get like-minded Latin American and African countries involved as well, so much the better. And so things like Sunak's initiative on AI and security last year were really good, worthwhile initiatives, so we should be looking for other opportunities. But to reinforce the point Sam was making, sometimes this may mean uncomfortable choices. The government here reckons that there are some advantages to take, and I agree with them on this, in exploiting life sciences to the full at a time when the European Union is being very cautious and small c conservative. And I've sat around the council table in Brussels where we've wrangled for 2 to 3 hours about whether to license a particular variety of experimental GM maize for experimental crop production in Spain, given the blessing by all the scientists, but for all the morals and ethical arguments about GM technology. But we're not members, so we can't shape what the EU does on that. And therefore, a British government has to weigh up, do we secure a greater advantage by taking a more liberal approach on GM technology, to take that argument, but it could apply to big data as well, where we are taking a different view from Brussels, and or do we lose because taking that course shuts us out from easier access to the European market that is on our doorstep? And there'll be different bits of British business that are arguing from different directions upon that. And these are just illustrations of the type of dilemma that is going to face whoever is in office here.
That's definitely the throwing more complications into the picture. But one thing when I think of regulatory cooperation, also one thing we actually have to do together, even in a multipolar world or in a very fragmented world, is save the planet. What is then the role of kind of trade policy, there are areas where we'll just have to cooperate, like it or not. We like each other, we don't like each other, we have the same values or we don't. And that's probably one of them where, you know, we've seen increasing amount of kind of trade policy looking at, you know, where things are coming from, whole agreements around critical minerals, especially for the tech sector and the products we produce as a sector that require minerals from all kinds of very unstable places. So I'm wondering what the intersection of that, you know, trade policy and tech, maybe George, I'll come to you. You know, where do you see maybe the opportunities? Because we've heard a lot of challenges. So maybe focus a bit on the opportunities of cooperation on trade for climate.
Thanks, Sabina. It really is an area that is evolving quite rapidly at the moment, and I'm not going to only speak to the opportunities because there are some challenges. But what I think we can see at the moment is trade policy is evolving rapidly in terms of how governments are using the tools available to them, particularly as we move away from progress at the WTO, we move away from progress in sort of those big free trade agreement negotiations. Towards on the cooperation side, we are seeing, you know, quite a big growth in critical mineral agreements between countries, both sort of among a critical minerals club that the EU has been pushing, as well as bilateral initiatives. So the UK has been working with like-minded partners in parts of Africa, South America to establish these new agreements. Supply chain resiliency agreements are another area. Supply chain security, whatever we call them, are another area where governments are looking to cooperate to establish new tools and new types of trade agreements. That is contrasted against the absolute rise in unilateral measures around trade and sustainability. The EU is definitely leading the way in this regard. So we've got CBAM, deforestation, supply chain due diligence, which is having some challenges in the European Council at the moment, but likely to eventually get through. The forced labor was politically agreed a couple of weeks ago. So it's not just around where countries are cooperating together, they're also looking to establish, you know, very new and serious regulatory regimes around traceability, around due diligence with regards to the products that are coming into their markets. That's meant to drive change through supply chains, but it is adding a huge amount of complexity to business. And so the question is, how do you navigate all of these new requirements, which is going to inevitably and likely push up cost and the amount of and types of products that can be used within the supply chain. So yes, there is cooperation, but it's not simply just a case of countries working together. There is a lot to navigate for the businesses with all of these new regimes coming into force.
So how do you navigate them?
So really important, I think, is putting in place that monitoring structure. A lot of companies are used to looking at their supply chain team, their customs team, whose job has historically been get, you know, things from point A to point B as quickly and cheaply as possible. That is no longer their job description. Whether it's CBAM and taking into account the embedded carbon within the supply chain, through to deforestation, has there been trees cut down in order to get that certain product, through to the forced labor regulations, that's going to mean really new and quite stringent controls on how products are sourced, particularly with regards to critical minerals. That's going to be an absolute concern, as well as some renewable energy products. So it's about putting in place that monitoring function into those teams. It's about educating, training, and giving the resources to those teams as well. And also at a C-suite leadership level, understanding that this is a fast-moving environment and that there's that need for constant review and working across the different parts of the business.
Thank you. That's, I mean, you know, it's just, it adds to the to-do list, if you want, of companies looking to kind of export internationally or trade. Even, you know, even if you look at kind of services and you think it's supposed to be slightly easier, the to-do list is growing there. So Maybe Sam, I'm going to bring you back in as we kind of look. The UK government has done a lot in the trade space. What you can say, it's adding a little bit to the GDP or more to the GDP, or it has more of a geopolitical impact than necessarily an immediate economic impact. I'm just wondering, is there a change in trade policy if there is a change in government?
So I don't know. I haven't asked shadow ministers directly about this, but my instinct is there'll probably be more continuity than there is change, quite frankly. I think given the Starmer team's ambition to have fastest growth in the European G7, I think is how they passed it, that's going to be quite challenging. They're going to have to try and pull every lever they possibly can to get a boost in GDP growth. And there's some big questions there, and that are very difficult to disentangle from other geopolitics. So I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago where somebody gave quite an upbeat assessment of possibilities for UK financial services firms selling into China. The thesis seemed to be the Chinese real estate market is in decline, which means that where a lot of slightly wealthier Chinese have been keeping their money is no longer such a safe bet, and so they need asset management support, and this is where the City of London could support it. Fantastic, yeah. I mean, that feels like maybe not, classic easy political sell territory because it's the stockbrokers rather than people in hard hats. But nonetheless, that's an opportunity for growth in the UK. How does that sit with the geopolitical winds or the geopolitical kind of mood elsewhere in the world? That it could be more difficult. The more we are open to trade with China, the more difficult territory we can enter into with other partners. And you touched earlier on saving the planet. The story around decarbonisation, really to succeed, is going to have to include a lot of China in the story, whether it's affordable EVs coming into the country, or it's solar panels, or it's many other things we need. A gumming up of the world trade system could be quite challenging for all of that. And so this is quite hard for people to kind of get their head around. I mean, I suppose in political terms, we're at probably the end of any belief that, or any kind of convincing political argument that there's a bunch of buccaneering trade deals the UK can do around the world, which will not only replace the lost EU revenue, but could, be even better. Which is not to say there aren't sensible bilateral deals that we can do, and we were still pursuing some of those, and I'm sure a theoretical Labour minister would want to do that as well. But it has to be in the context, as I said earlier, of a sensible strategy towards Europe and a realistic assessment of what's achievable, which might just be almost get back to the status quo of previous EU deals. In some cases, it might be slightly more ambitious in others.
Excellent. So you need an industrial strategy, a trade strategy, and then an implementation strategy. This all sounds very easy. Kati, I'll bring you back in because, one of the things the UK has done is kind of join the club of the countries at the kind of front line of digital trade, right? So we're joining the CPTPP with Australia, New Zealand, Japan. We've seen really good digital trade chapters in there. We've then seen kind of digital-only trade agreements with, that make them almost like living trade agreements with memorandum of understanding attached to them that allow them to kind of be updated more regularly and be, kept up to speed. It's also with countries that, are fairly open economies as well. So it's not a massive revolutionary policy in a way. However, does the US get FOMO, given that, everyone else seems to be moving in that direction, but there's no digital trade kind of policy conversation in Washington?
Yeah, actually admiring all the trade agreements that UK has been able to forge, particularly in the Asia Pacific, and I think there are some very positive elements in addition to what has already been negotiated, for instance, in the CPTPP earlier. So some of the agreements that we have struck since that time, I think are a very, very, very good roadmap for for other countries to hit. Well, I don't think the US has particular FOMO. I think there's just this continued move toward more isolationist US policy. That's it. I think there's an opportunity to partner on some of these issues like AI, like supply chain security, like possibly the Biden administration, if that they remain in power, the climate issues that were mentioned already. And certainly, I would say on the development agenda as well, as we haven't touched on that necessarily. You know, you have your FCDO, we have our USAID and others in the constellation of agencies. And I think there could be an opportunity there to support, for instance, ongoing digital trade agreement discussions with the ASEAN that was mentioned before, certainly with the African countries as well in the context of the AFCFTA. Perhaps in these agreements as well and these partnerships, we could together work on, again, securing supply chains, securing safe ports, greening the global trade ecosystem, particularly in the developing nations, and also these issues of traceability. How do we ensure that developing country SMEs are able to take advantage of US, UK markets, even with the new traceability standards? And we have here, for instance, the Food and Drug Administration will have in 2026 new traceability mandates for certain foods and so on. So at the Europeans, of course, have their digital product passport. You may have something similar, I don't know exactly. But there could be an opportunity to work together on these kinds of developing country issues, particularly in light of the discussions that are ongoing in many regions on digital trade regulations. Now, you know, would US actually join a CPTPP, for instance? I doubt it. It's not only a matter of the administrations, there's also quite a lot of anti-trade sentiment yet again in US Congress, particularly on the Democrat side, and kind of anti-big tech agenda that permeates our trade policy now. So I don't necessarily see that, and that of course undermines the leverage that US companies have, for instance, in Asia Pacific, to push digital trade agenda, and the same with the, for instance, on these digital trade issues, AI Act, DMA, a number of other issues with the Europeans. There's really the administration stance has undermined our leverage for sure, and has hampered US companies. But I don't see that necessarily changing. But I do see there's an opportunity for US-UK collaboration on digital issues, on standards, on trade in general. As I said, Sabina, the UK has struck perhaps agreements with markets that have been quite open already. You're a quite open market, so I don't think there will be a huge kind of distributional impacts from US-UK deal, but it could be a useful standard-setting venue for both sides, and then from that, work together on maybe some of these development issues, maybe some of the supply chain issues, and so on. So that's what I would see.
Thank you, Kati. We have just a few minutes for maybe one or two questions from the room. So if there are any questions in the room, please raise your hands. Yeah, I thought so. It's that time of the afternoon, isn't it? Fair enough. You're getting your coffee in about 4 minutes' time. What I want to end this panel on... Oh, we have a...
Thank you very much. Very subtle.
Very good. Oh.
Hi, Adi Holt. I work
Then it's me who needs coffee. There you go, please.
We all do. It's Adi Holt, and I work for an organisation called Form 1 Partners. We help small businesses grow. But very early on in the conversation, you mentioned the war in Ukraine, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, very briefly. To my mind, government and policy have been very slow in admitting that actually we're under attack. This isn't just something that's going on in Eastern Europe. This is us that's under attack. And unless that war is won, then some of the stuff we've been discussing here won't come to fruition because there'll be other priorities. We won't get to address the environmental problem because, unfortunately, the budget will go to defence and security, and we won't get the liberal view to tech because we will be driven by other budgetary constraints, or, if the worst comes to the worst, much more oppressive regimes and systems. So to what end should the policymakers be making it much clearer to the UK population, in fact, the allied populations that we are under attack, we are at war, and put us in a position where we can move to a much stronger footing to get our industrial base and our technology systems ready for the challenges that are ahead.
Thank you. Now you
Just a small question
got a
for the
question on
audience.
war in Europe. There you go.
Yeah.
To end,
I'd say a couple of points. First, I actually think that the UK's response has been pretty good and strong on this, second only to the Baltics and the Poles in Europe. Certainly quicker off the mark, I think, than Paris, Berlin, or Washington. Secondly, yes, there's more that could and should be said, because I think that no Western government has really faced up to its electorate and said it is vital to our national security that Ukraine wins. This means we are going to have to forego public expenditure, we're going to have to raise taxes to fund the support that Ukraine needs, and, given what we now know about the depletion rates for munitions, to stock up for our own defence in the future. That, I think, is what needs to be said. There's all sorts of issues about the MOD here being absolutely useless under successive governments at defence procurement, and which means successive chancellors have lost all confidence in their ability to manage their budgets. But that's something that does need to be gripped and sorted out by whoever is in office here. But I agree with you in your broad analysis.
Thank you. I'm not sure we've reassured any small company in the room that the world is about to get, kind of easier to navigate. But I do think, we've had the range of expertise on the panel on just the various complexities we are facing, and the world in which the UK and the new UK government will have to kind of figure out its own trajectory. And it is complex, and it is going to be a lot more fragmented, and we'll kind of all need to kind of work through it. But please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you so much.